Okay, so the next step of scenario planning in this stage is to go through and look at all of those trends that you've got across that chart. And the more you've got, the easier it is to go through and do this next process. Okay, so we now have to go through and choose two different independent trends to go through and do our 2x2 matrix. So I'm going to show you some examples of how others have done this. Okay, so Thomas Chermak, the person I mentioned in the first class, who's written probably the best applied book on scenario planning, he looks at a technology company, and he goes through and plots different themes, and he does it in these boxes that you can go through and see on this particular diagram. Left-hand side, he's got the uncertainty variable. On the bottom here, you've got the relative impact, right, on the industry. So it's slightly different dimensions, but exactly the same wording. And then he goes through and plots the different ones across there. Okay, it could be about developing markets. It could be about finding the right niche industry. It could be about employees. It could be about the global energy market. But he plots each one of those trends across this diagram. Okay, and then he places two different boxes in there. Okay, at the midpoint of both, he goes through and places where is the midpoint of uncertainty and where is the midpoint of impact. So take a look at this for a few seconds, because this is what you're going to be doing, and you're going to be trying to go through and work out which variables to choose. The most important variables for scenario planning is in the area which is high uncertainty and high in potential impact. Now that could be in different areas depending on where you've positioned your low and high variable. For this particular example, it's in the top right-hand corner, okay? And those are the ones which are more likely to go through and have a significant impact on the business, the industry, and also have the highest level of unpredictability, right? So for this one, there's about 7 or 8 variables that can be chosen for the next step of scenario planning, top right-hand corner. And a further example of this is taken from Deloitte. One of my alumni that I taught in Hong Kong is working at Deloitte, and he was looking at the telecommunications industry. And he wanted to go through and plot different things based on what's called STEEP. STEEP is the social, technological, environmental, economic, and political trends. Each one of them is color-coded. And he went through and put those color-coded in this particular diagram. Multiple trends that might relate to energy consumption, which is in the top left-hand box. It might be based around the bundling or unbundling of services, or industry consolidation, which is in the right-hand side. It might be CO2 emissions, which is put into the bottom left-hand corner. Okay? Customer loyalty is in the bottom right-hand corner. But for scenario planning, the key thing is the top right-hand corner. Okay? If we take a few minutes to think back to the shortcut exercises, horizon planning takes everything on this particular matrix. Wargaming takes some of those isolated, most extreme examples to go through and consider. But for scenario planning, it's all about that zone of interest. High unpredictability, high in terms of potential impact. Top right-hand corner, okay? So that's the starting point, is to go through and think about those particular trends, those variables. And then you take 2 of those. So for this particular alumni, he took customer relationship with telecommunications and the competence of technology, or technology competence. So he went through from this diagram, right, zone of interest, and then he chose customer relationship and technology competence as the 2 independent variables, right? Independent, meaning they're quite different to each other. So he didn't say climate change and pollution, for example, because they are 2 quite dependent variables. He didn't take sort of economic growth with another economic factor. These have got to be 2 independent variables, okay? So you go through, take those 2, and then you go through and have 2 very different outcomes. So for customer relationship, at the top, it's got customer relationship remains good with telecommunication companies. Then at the bottom, it's actually the opposite of that. For technology competence, you've got full technology competence on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you've got technology competence returns to the players within the telecommunications industry. So entirely different, right? You have to have two extremes within these variables. And that gives you then 4 different possible outcomes. Each one of them is plausible, possible, but very different from one another. And scenario planning is really at this stage based around how can you build up a picture in each of these 4 variables, because these are 4 potential future situations. A reminder, scenario planning says there's not one certain future. There are many different plausible outcomes because you've got all of these different types of events that are taking place, and the future is volatile. We're not sure how it's going to pan out. So scenario planning is trying to give us some of those options. Okay, so this is the next stage. And then you give each stage a name. Okay, so those names are in the top left-hand corner, the virtual telco company. In the top right-hand, is called the engineer strikes back. The bottom right-hand corner is called the new wholesale truth. In the bottom left-hand corner, it's called a vendor brand. And the purpose of this part of scenario planning is then to go through and add much more detail to each of these 4 different possible future alternatives. And this is where we're trying to get you towards by the end of the 3rd session, is to start giving a little bit more detail. Right? Number 1 is to go through and choose the 2 variables that form your 2 by 2. Number 2 is to go through and give a relatively catchy title to each of those 4 plausible future outcomes. And then to go through and write your storyline for each of those. And you start by doing that by coming up with 1 or 2 bullet points, as this example has got. Okay? So let's take this through step by step. Right? Your end point today is to get to this particular situation, storyline, and then start writing the stories of the future of the world, because we need to go through and develop creativity in our mind to imagine what it could look like in 10 years' time. Once you can imagine what it looks like, then you can think about how it impacts your business, and then develop your contingency plans. This is why step 3 is such a long process, right? Because you're trying to imagine the future, then you're trying to think about the consequences on your company, and then finally, what is your contingency to go through and react to that, or to exploit the opportunities that arise. Okay, so exercise 3.4 is to go through, and in your groups, I would like you to go through and decide on which 2 variables which are in that zone of interest, high unpredictability and high impact. Right? Make sure you've got enough variables in that particular box, and you only choose from that box, right? So that's your purpose for now. And again, you might want to use the dot voting technique to work out which of the trends are the most interest, the ones that you think are the most important for you to choose. They must be independent of one another. So there shouldn't be 2 economics, there shouldn't be 2 geopolitical thrown together, they should be independent.